Hi, my name's Judd and I'm from the Data Standards body, and welcome to our YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to recap the recent workshop that we had introducing the consumer data right to the telecommunication sector. In that session, there was a number of topics that were covered, including the consumer data standards as a whole, both technical and consumer experience, as well as an overview of the legislation and the rules framework. This overview was conducted by the Treasury as a special guest in the session hosted by the Data Standards body. Please enjoy the video.
My name is Wendy Hau. I'm the Director of the pithily named Rules for New Sectors unit in the Consumer Data Rights Division in Commonwealth Treasury. And I'm here to speak for about 15 minutes or so about the legislation and the rules. I won't speak to the standards. I'll leave that to the people on the call who are much better placed to do that. But starting with the legislation and the rules and then kind of moving on to the standards after this, I'll hand over, I think, back to you, James. But if we go to the next slide, I've got an overview of what I'm planning to cover. So the CDR regulatory framework, that's again the legislation, part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act, and then also touching on the CDR rules and standards and how they operate, and then doing a little bit more detail into what the CDR rules actually entail, what kinds of data is being shared under the rules, how consent and authorisation works, a little bit on accreditation, and then a little bit about banking and energy specific rules. So we might move to the next slide. And this is a very high level summary of the regulatory framework that we operate under. So the CDR legislation is, think of it as the umbrella. That's what the framework sits underneath. And it creates essentially the CDR regime. It does quite a few different bits and bobs, which I'll get into in a little bit on the next slide. But just wanted to give you a snapshot of the legislation sits as the overarching umbrella. Then we've got general CDR rules and standards, that those are the rules and standards that apply regardless of sector, they're universal. And then we've got banking specific rules and standards, energy specific rules and standards, and other specific rules and standards. So quite a few different elements and tiers, if you will, that come with the CDR regulatory framework. So we'll move to the next slide and I'll talk about what the legislation actually covers. Like I said, that's part 4D of the Competition and Consumer Act. And there are quite a few elements to this. I tried to break it up into broad categories and then inevitably had a miscellaneous category thrown in as well. But starting with designation. So designation is where the Minister makes an instrument designating what sector CDR will now apply to. And under the legislation, there's specific requirements in the designation process and then also specific powers that the Minister has in terms of designation. Think of designation as the first step that needs to be taken for a sector to apply to CDR. And it kind of sets the groundwork for who are the data holders, what kinds of data sets are we talking about, and it tries to be cast as broadly as possible because then the rules come in. So that's the next box down, rules. The legislation covers off on the rulemaking process, rulemaking powers. Again, the rulemaking powers are held by the Minister, and then a regulation making power, and then emergency rules for things that we don't really expect but need to throw in to make sure the system operates well. We haven't had a need for emergency rules yet, so I think we're tracking pretty well. And then the following box down is the standards. So the standards are enabled under the CDR legislation and also under the rules framework. And this part of the legislation covers the standard making powers. So the standards, unlike the rules and the designation instrument, the standards are actually made by the Data Standards Chair. And then this part of the legislation also covers off on the role of the Data Standards body. If we move over to the next column, you'll see data requirements are also outlined in the legislation. So this is broadly how the framework operates in terms of data holder roles, accredited data recipients, and getting accredited, what the broad definition and the universal definition might be for a CDR consumer, and what kinds of data sets we're talking about as well. Similarly, the role of regulators. So James spoke about ACCC and the OAIC. Those two bodies and their roles in relation to CDR are also outlined in the legislation. And finally, accreditation. So things like the requirement for there to be an accreditation registrar, a data recipient accreditor, and then also a register of accredited persons. And the accreditation role is largely sitting within the ACCC. And you'll see actually as well the register of accredited persons actually sits on the cdr.gov.au website. So feel free to have a sticky beak over there and have a look at the various CDR providers that have been accredited. And then finally, my miscellaneous category. The legislation also provides for privacy safeguards. Those are administered by the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, the OAIC. It also has broad rules around dispute resolution and also penalties. So you can see the Competition and Consumer Act covers a lot of territory. But if you move to the next slide, I might just briefly cover off CDR rules and standards. So the legislation sits there as the backbone and the framework for the regime, but then the rules and the standards operate together to actually have the detail of how the regime actually functions and operates and how it regulates the players as well. So as I mentioned before, we've got these sector agnostic rules or the universal rules, and that makes up about 80% of the rules if you count page numbers. And then as a schedule to those sector agnostic rules, we also have banking and energy sector specific rules. And the idea there is that those specific rules can actually be tailored to the specific operational needs and requirements of that sector. We try to go universal wherever we can. Data sharing regimes should be as universal as they can be, but they don't always get there. So a little bit of specificity is always required. And then I'll just touch on the fact that there are also CDR standards and guidelines. The standards are on GitHub, and then there are some guidelines on things like consumer experience, explaining how a consumer should be expected to engage with CDR if they're going through that process of sharing their data. So I might move to the next slide, go into a little bit more detail about what we mean by the CDR rules. So I mentioned designation before. Designation doesn't actually enliven any data sharing obligations for data holders. It's really the rules and the technical standards that work together to make sure that data sharing obligations flow. So again, sector agnostic rules, sector specific schedules, and the technical standards all work together to make sure that there's specific requirements on the data sharing journey. So we like to describe it as where the rubber meets the road. Previously, we said that it was just the rules were where the rubber meets the road, but I think it's fair to say it's in concert with the standards. It's together where the rubber hits the road for a lot of obligations in CDR. I'll move to the next slide where I give a little bit of an overview of the kinds of data that we're talking about. So broadly speaking, there's two categories. There's product reference data, which think of that as data about the products that are being offered by data holders. So different transaction accounts, savings accounts, different products from the energy sector as well. And then you've also got consumer data, and you should think about that as data that is about a consumer. And that's the kind of data that's shared with data recipients in order for the data recipients to provide products and services to that consumer. I've just extracted definitional examples out of the banking schedule to the right there. You don't need to read those in detail, but it gives you a little bit of a flavour for what we're talking about. So product data includes things like the type of product, the name of the product, any fees, interest rates, associated features and benefits, and eligibility requirements. And then when we talk about consumer data, one part of that is customer data, but there's also billing data, usage data. It really depends on the kind of information that's being captured by a data holder. So that's just one example of what consumer data is about. So the person's name, contact details, address, and then eligibility requirements being met to acquire a certain product, for example. So I might move to the next slide, which talks a little bit in the technical side about consent and authorisation. So another key element of the consumer data right is consent and authorisation. A consumer consents to the collection, use and disclosure of data. And it's very important to highlight that we're not just talking about your ordinary drowning in terms and conditions type consent. In the case of the consumer data right, consent is critical. So we talk about voluntary consent, express consent, informed consent, and consent that's specific as to purpose, time limited, and also easily withdrawn. The idea is that the consumer really is in control here, informed and in control, and that their consent isn't a forever consent. It's specific as to purpose and it's time limited, and they get to choose every step of the way. I'd also like to point out that there's the data minimization principle. The idea here is that data recipients shouldn't be looking to get the whole kit and caboodle when it comes to what kind of data they're requesting from a data holder on behalf of the consumer. They should be requesting instead data that is actually relevant to the service that they're seeking to provide to the consumer. So that could mean that it's time limited. If you only need a year's worth of transactions to derive the insights that you want, then you might minimize the data that you collect to just 1 year. So that's consumer consent. It's also worth noting that the consumer also needs to authorize the data holder to share data. So there's a complicated diagram out there, which I probably should have included in these slides, but haven't, that shows that the process for consent and authorization requires the consumer to actually interact with the data holder and also with the data recipient. And that's to make sure that the consumer is actually the data holder is disclosing consumer data that is actually relevant to that right consumer. We don't want data holders not authorized, making sure that that data sharing is authorized. So the data holders have to be satisfied that they're dealing with the right customer before they release that data. The other element here is the dashboard requirement. So data holders and data recipients are required to establish dashboards for their consumers. And this goes back to that point of easily withdrawing consent. Consumers that are provided with a dashboard can easily toggle on or off when it comes to what they share, and they can also review what kinds of permissions they've already given to data recipients. So the consumer is very much in the driver's seat here as well. And then finally, just touching on the idea of redundant data or spent data. So once the service or product has been provided to the consumer from the data recipient, the consumer can choose whether or not they want that data deleted or de-identified. And so that, again, puts the consumer in the driver's seat. My next slide talks about accreditation. So I'll touch on this very briefly. Like I said, accredited providers can be found on the cdr.gov.au website, and the register is administered by the ACCC. It's important to note that the rules set out the criteria to be accredited, and it's a pretty high bar that we expect. There are information security requirements, dispute resolution requirements. Of course, there has to be a way to provide service of address. There's a fit and proper person test, and then also insurance and guarantees to make sure that you've got proper protections in place and backups if anything goes wrong. It's also worth noting that recent changes to the rules mean that there are now 2 levels of accreditation. Unrestricted level of accreditation essentially means what it says. You're unrestricted in terms of what kind of data you're holding and accessing. Whereas sponsored level of accreditation means that you aren't accredited in your own right, but you're an affiliate of someone that sponsored you. So you can become a data recipient without being accredited if you can find a sponsor, and then you share liability to an extent. It's quite a technical area, so I won't go into much more detail on accreditation. But there's guidance material on the ACCC website as well. And for my final slide, I thought I'd repeat this point about the banking and energy schedules to the CDR rules. So we've got our universal rules, and then we've got Schedule 3 and Schedule 4 to the rules. And these rules are the ones that are specific to the banking sector and the energy sector. So these schedules can define what kinds of data we're talking about that need to be shared. It also establishes where implementation of obligations is staged. So with the banking and energy sector, starting with the big banks and the biggest energy retailers, all of that detail is actually in the rules and in these schedules to the rules. The rules also outline what is considered an eligible consumer. And so in the energy sector, for example, certain very, very large commercial and industrial customers haven't been defined as eligible consumers on the basis that they aren't really consumers of energy in the ordinary sense. They actually negotiate their own agreements. So eligible consumers can be tailored specifically to a sector where appropriate as well. And touching on dispute resolution providers, the schedules to the rules also outline the relevant dispute resolution mechanisms that come with data sharing. So where a consumer might have an issue with data being shared by a data holder or data being requested by a data recipient, it's these rules that outline the internal dispute resolution processes to an extent, but more importantly, I think really outlines the external dispute resolution providers, and those are specific to the energy and banking sector, particularly for data holders who are already members of these dispute resolution providers.